Greetings, Maisha from Project Inklud checking in on our Twitter and YouTube accounts. Seems as though some people are wanting a practical way to deal with competition in the work culture. Really good question. One of the reasons that competition is such a hard thing to understand is because depending on which organization or which individual you ask, it may be a good or a bad thing, depending on that particular organization or that particular person. One thing I can say for sure, though, is regardless of if competition is part of your organizational culture or not, there is a good type of competition and then there is a bad type of competition. A bad type of competition by organizational standards is any type of competition that's politically based on individual or small group power and seeking to advance one group's interests or thoughts or culture over another. That type of competition in the workforce, always bad. Good competition, on the other hand, one that moves toward what I call prosperity, is actually very good for the workplace. And we get this type of competition handed to us by things like sports, right? Healthy competition that keeps both the individual and the team advancing and getting better. Healthy competition. Okay, so once you know that the type of competition in your organization is going toward that good, prosperous end, I have a way for you to understand even further what your organizational culture is doing with competition and how it is that a person should be prepared or can be prepared to act and react within that particular culture of competition. All right, so if we were in a consultation, I would put this on a fancy matrix like this, okay? And this matrix is allowing me to assess two things. First is whether or not your organization needs to be competitive and how much so, right? Second question, how much, if at all, are you as an individual and you as your organization comfortable in dealing with competition? There are certain people who have just a competitive spirit through and through, and other people who have a much harder time being productive within a competitive culture. So this matrix is going to allow you to compare those two values when it comes to competition. And by comparing these two values, you'll be able to understand how it is both you and your organization are managing, as it were, competition. Okay, so for the sake of simplicity, let's break this matrix and this way of understanding competition into 4 zones. I'm going to tell you how the zone relates to the matrix that we talked about, and then I'm also going to give you a name or a metaphor, as it were, for this zone, so you can be able to see and feel how it is competition plays itself out in this particular type of culture. Okay, zone 1. Zone 1 is comprised of organizational cultures that have a high need for competition and a high comfort level with competition. So these are externally focused organizations that have to be competitive on the go, quick changing, and at the same time, they're comprised of people and also really good at and comfortable with being in that competitive mode. For simplicity's sake, we're going to call this the lion's den. Why? Because if you weren't a lion, then you probably wouldn't go in, and if you did, you should be prepared to get your head ripped off by the lion. And if you are a lion, you better be prepared to be the strongest lion, or you're probably going to die. I know that sounds dire, but in these type of work cultures, that's exactly what competition is like, the lion's den. High need for competition and a high comfort level with competition. Zone number 1. Zone number 2. Like zone number 1, it has a high need for competition. It's externally focused, fast-paced. For whatever reason, it needs to be competitive. But unlike zone number 1, it's comprised of people, or for whatever reason, its system isn't very comfortable with dealing with competition. I'm thinking of, on an individual level, this may be an entry-level sales position where a person really wants to make those sales dollars but may not be that comfortable with putting themselves out there and moving past rejection in the way that would say that they are comfortable with the type of competition that a high sales job would call for. Okay, so in zone 2, these are high need for competition, low comfort level with competition. I call this the jungle. And I call it the jungle because animals and people are still at risk and they better watch out. The animals are a little bit more of an advantage. Perhaps they're not as fierce as the lion's den, but they're animals all the same. And the people who go in the jungle, well, the more prepared you are, the better, right? Because the jungle's scary and you're only going to make it if you have the tools to survive. That's exactly what these work cultures are like. So, in zone number 2, competition is a little bit more like a jungle. It's not as fierce as the lion's den. Maybe you're not as comfortable, but with development and training, you can perhaps develop a comfort level, and or perhaps you just realize that culture is not for you and leave. Okay, so that's zone 2. Zone 3. Now we're in the realm of organizations that don't necessarily have a high need for competition. And I could oversimplify this in a more corporate way, but I'd like to oversimplify this zone by calling it mean girls. Why? Because in that group of girls where all of the pretty girls band together and have a competition for who can be the meanest, none of them stop to realize that there is enough pretty to go around and there is no reason to be competitive. All the same, individuals in these type of work cultures bring that competition and they bring it fierce. It doesn't matter if they don't need it. So in zone 3, where it's a low need for competition, but a high comfort level with competition, like those girls in Mean Girls, we're going to call that Mean Girls because they're work cultures that are just like that. If you're wondering what these work cultures look like or how it is they evolve to be like that, take a look at if your a good clue is that if your workplace has a high if there is a lot of competition to get into your workplace, especially for numbers. I'm thinking police. I know a great example, dance teams. I have a background in dance and performance, and for college and professional dance teams, there are 450 girls who audition for a team that has 12 people. Now, once you get on that team, collaboration, teamwork, trust, all of that stuff is paramount. But because the competitive means by which you got there has constructed your brain, a lot of times on these teams, even though there is no actual need for competition, you find people competing anyway because it was such fierce conditions for them to get there. So those we're going to call mean girls because they have a low need for competition but a very, very high comfort level with competitiveness for whatever reason. Okay, finally, zone 4. Zone 4 is easy. Why? Because it's the place that a lot of us feel like we could survive most easily. These are organizations that have a low need for competitiveness for whatever reason. Maybe it's that you are a staple in your field. Maybe you have no competition whatsoever. Maybe you're not externally focused. Maybe it's just you and you've done your individual work for quite some time, but for whatever reason, there's not a huge need for competition within your workforce. At the same time, your organization seems to be real comfortable with not being competitive, which means that you're probably really uncomfortable with being competitive, which is a clue that things might be a little bit stagnant, right? So that's the thing about any of these zones. Each of these zones have their issues that they need to work out, but we're using this as a way to understand how both we as individuals and we as small groups and organizations are managing our competition. So, going back to zone 4, we are in the low need, low comfort level of competition zone. We're calling that the bear cave. Why? Because those bears are sleeping, they don't want to be woken up, and for sure, if you are the person who wakes them up, doesn't matter if they're not competitive, they're still going to kill you. This happens when we get a young and ambitious individual who enters into an organization that's quite established and they're wanting to move and shake things, and everyone's like, whoa, that's not the way we do things around here. So, these 4 zones are a way that you can begin to understand how it is both you and your organization are managing competition. Competition's never going to go away. Things are changing too fast.